All right, well, welcome everybody. I am going to go ahead and share my screen here. That is not how to share a screen. I want to present, go into that mode. So, thank you all for joining this here class here. This is edible landscaping. We're going to talk about the plants that make edible landscaping possible. And um, this is a topic that we have kind of spent a lot of years researching and talking with other growers and figuring out what really works for this work. So, the thing that makes this a unique presentation is, or the reason that we even need to talk about edible landscaping plants is because so many of the common plants that we utilize to grow food have different pest and disease pressure. And a lot of times they don't really look too great in the landscape. It's, very common to find things like apple trees, grapes, peaches, plums. A lot of these common plants, especially fruits in this case, are oftentimes plagued with a bit of disease pressure such that they don't often lend themselves too well to edible landscaping. With edible landscaping, our goal is oftentimes to achieve the same goals that we see in traditional landscaping, which we'll talk about here in a second. But we want things to look nice. We don't want them to have bagworms all over them. We don't want to see fungus all over our fruits or spots all over leaves. Maybe that doesn't bother you, but the unfortunate reality is that our common culture is kind of has a different expectation, and to achieve the kinds of beautiful landscapes that I think a lot of people strive for, we are going to focus on a lot of the uncommon fruits and plants in general that we are typically using for edible landscaping. So really quick, kind of want to talk about, what I think are maybe two of the reasons why it's so hard to do edible landscaping work and with the trees and plants that are much more common, the apples and the grapes and things like that. The main two reasons are that we are here in the eastern part of the United States, and a lot of this presentation is geared towards the eastern half of the United States, or maybe even eastern half of Canada, east of the Rocky Mountains, I should say. We are in a really humid, moist environment, and what that means is that we don't really have dry spells or a dry season to break up a lot of the pest and disease cycles that are often broken up in more dry areas. So much of the pathogen cycle of pests and ultimately the diseases, of diseases and ultimately a lot of the pests that follow them are fungal related. And of course, we know that fungi are, skipping around a little bit here, are generally come about because of different fungal issues. And those fungal issues are moisture related. So we've got this humid environment that is pretty much around all year round. We get rain, we get humidity from 365 days a year. And that's one reason why it's really hard to grow a lot of fruits and other edibles and have them look good all year round. Now, the other main reason is that we have taken so many Asian and European fruits and veggies and plants, and we've brought them to our climate where we often we have these exotic plants that aren't well adapted to our climate. And what what I would argue we should be doing is focusing on natives. And we have so many fantastic native fruits, and I think putting those at the centerpiece of our edible landscaping would be really helpful in making sure that we've got beautiful landscapes and we don't have those apple trees plagued by disease. So that's not to say we don't ever plant apples, but it's just to say that a lot of we would like to start with the natives, and then we like to focus on plants that are way more resilient against pest and disease pressure. And obviously this presentation is going to be a talk on what those plants are. So it's not all bad news, as I mentioned. There are tons of plants that we're going to talk about in this presentation that I think lend themselves beautifully to edible landscaping, and we're gonna look at those. I think that a lot of the common plants, especially a lot of the crappy varieties, so many of the varieties that we see at our local nurseries and our local hardware stores are all junk in terms of disease and pest susceptibility, and a lot of times they aren't the best of the varieties that we can grow of plants, they're oftentimes just the most known, the ones that people are generally used to seeing in the grocery stores. So, this is a little bit of a rundown of just some of the general strategies that we see utilized in landscaping. And I want to point out that I don't think any of these are, these are all things that I think we're aware of. And I just want to put them out there so we have some language around them. We can point them out and say, yeah, this is what this is doing. We've got hedges, we've got ground covers, we've got specimens and focal points. We've even got shade trees. These are all really important parts of the landscaping world. And when utilizing edible plants, it's no different. We're just going to be swapping out a lot of the plants, but utilizing the same features. So we've got other things. We've got sunny understory plantings. We've got vines that will hopefully be growing on structures. We got shade, the understory shade plantings, and then borders and edges. We find that really, all of these are super important for us to just be thinking about and have in our toolbox, so that when we're matching certain landscapes with an aesthetic that we believe to be best fitting for that spot, that we can talk about this in language that we all understand. And then some other, less traditional landscaping strategies, some that have risen out of some of the permaculture literature, are these ideas of, intentional guild plantings or the keyhole beds, and utilizing more round shapes. We've got things like herb spirals and hugelkultur. These are all different ways of adding in texture and design, and creating shapes and ultimately landscapes that are going to be fitting for what our clients are looking for. So this is no different than a lot of the general landscapes that we see, where we see plantings like this. And basically what we're doing is we're looking at landscapes like this, and we're saying, how can we swap out the plants that we see in a picture like this so that they are edible landscaping plants? And what that means for us really is, like, we want to be providing food, we want to be providing beauty, we want to provide things like forage for native insects and bees, and we want to be able to of course provide as much to eat from that landscape as possible. And we want, that includes things like medicine, and includes things like tea. The more diverse that landscape, the better. But the real important thing, and I think this is a really, this is what edible landscaping is kind of all about for me, is this idea of interacting with the landscape. What we don't want to have is a landscape that we just look at and find it to be beautiful. That has its own merit, but our tagline at Custom Foodscaping is have your landscape and eat it too. And we want it to be something that we can interact with. How many times can we touch, smell, taste, and experience the landscape? Because, that's what's so life-giving about edible landscaping, is being a part of it. I think that that's one of the huge conservation lessons that is gaining popularity now, is the idea that, the most productive, the best landscape for ecological diversity and for meeting human needs is not the one that we walk away from and just let succession take place and become a forest. A well-managed landscape is ultimately going to be the one that's the most diverse and the most high yielding, both for people and planet. So with that said, I want to kind of jump into the plants, and we're going to look at, first we're going to start with some of the bigger plants here, and then we're going to work our way down from trees to shrubs and into ground covers and things like that. So first I want to talk about the chestnut. We are every opportunity we can, we plant chestnut trees. It is the bread tree. It is such a delicious nut tree. It's very unlike any other nut, sometimes known as the unnut. And generally what we plant are Chinese chestnuts. If you're not familiar, the American chestnut, which was a super common nut tree in the United States at some point, 100 plus years ago here, got hit by a blight, and that blight wiped out pretty much all the American chestnuts. And it was kind of an overstory tree that had very few selections with big nuts, and it was maybe actually not super well suited to the kinds of work that we are generally doing in urban and suburban landscapes. But we love the Chinese chestnut, and there have been many crosses hybridized with the American or European chestnut. So there's lots of different chestnut genetics out there. We generally plant the Chinese chestnuts. They're about 30 feet tall. We have good access to them here in St. Louis from Forest Keeling Nursery, and to a lot of those grafted improved varieties. The Chinese chestnut is generally going to be a tall big tree. It got a nice round shape to it. It does produce spiky burrs, and so that's a really important consideration if planting these for a client, that you can see these burrs in the bottom picture there. Yeah, those are not fun to touch. They're not fun to mess around with, and oftentimes picking up the chestnuts are, it's a spiky endeavor. So would recommend that, that's done with gloves or a nut wizard if they're falling onto the ground, which is a nut picking up tool. Whether you're doing this or you're doing it, having a client do it, it's important that they understand these considerations. But it is a fantastic tree. We put this on a lot of our homesteads, and the reason that we do it is because it's such a, like I said, it's like the bread tree, and what that means is that it produces a very carbohydrate rich meat, and it's very easy to process. So unlike a lot of other great nuts, hickories and walnuts, things that grow very commonly in our climate, the chestnut is super easy to process. You cut a little X in it and roast it, and then it's good to go. You can easily put it into dishes and things like that. It's not a hard nut to crack, if you want to put it that way. Whereas a lot of other nut trees are tough to crack. So putting that out there is just some general knowledge for what to know about the chestnut. They also are much earlier to produce than a lot of other nut trees. So in 5 years, you can have a nice looking chestnut tree that's even giving you a yield, whereas something like walnut or pecan can take a lot longer than that. And there's so many good genetics and so much improved seed out there, even for chestnut. It's a great one to work with. It's also pretty fast growing, so not only does it produce, is it somewhat precocious, but it's somewhat fast growing. Now, another one very close to my heart, gosh, and I may end up saying that about all these trees here, but is the American persimmon. Now, the American persimmon is a really common tree to find in the woods around these parts, in Missouri, where I'm presenting here. And it's truly a remarkable tree. It produces maybe the sweetest fruit I've ever had, and can produce huge amounts of it. Totally doesn't need any sprays or pruning. It's a very beautiful tree. If you grow it out in the open, in a non shady environment, it's got a nice rounded form. If you grow it amongst other trees, it'll definitely kind of be nice and tall. I have heard or visited Lee Reich, who's written extensively on fruit trees, and he was topping his American persimmon trees, I think around 15 feet tall, and having them branch out. And so that's something that we've been doing and encouraging folks to do, to just keep the fruit from falling from so high up. And so this is one of those things where if you're not familiar with this fruit, it's got very astringent, chalky texture to it if you eat it too early. You have to make sure that the persimmon fruit is super, super, uber duper ripe, and it's got to be usually picked from off the ground. So thinking about a really nice soft landing pad for American persimmon can also be nice. Bunch of, if you're coming into persimmon season, you might even throw down a ton of straw down on the base, because a nice soft landing on the ground will help with cracked kind of fruits. I think there's huge, possibilities with American persimmon, and like so many other natives, it is often thought of as kind of this isn't something that we plant. This is just something that you might go eat one of in the woods. And I think that's a really, important educational piece for us to talk about with clients, is that, there are a lot of improved varieties of American persimmon, and a lot of these varieties are very well suited to suburban plantings. They often need several persimmons in order to be cross-pollinated. There's male and female persimmons, and of course we want the female persimmons if we want to get the fruit. A male does need to be present in order to pollinate, but there are several self-fertile American persimmons as well that you can look at. And I will say, one of the things I don't love about American persimmon is that some of the leaves can get kind of tattered and black, and they don't often look really great. So, I made this statement earlier that so many of the native fruits are the ones that look good, and a lot of the exotic fruits like the peaches and apples don't often look great. This is kind of an exception. I often see the American persimmon doesn't look awesome. Sometimes it can look fine, but it's kind of got the leaves get some kind of black spotting on them, and doesn't usually look great. one of the awesome things about it aesthetically is that a lot of times the fruit will hang on well into the winter. And this is one of the most amazing things about the American persimmon is that the fruit will often hang on well into November, sometimes even into December. And um, this is a super, desirable characteristic because no other fruits can really hold on that long. And even after the frost, they can still produce very palatable, great to eat fruit. So, and they look like just amazing ornaments, as you can see in that bottom left-hand picture, if you uh, let them go, that long. And some varieties are different than others, so you want to check that out. There's very early producing varieties, and then there's super late producing varieties. Some of the late producing varieties are awesome because they give you fruit in November and December. Some of the downfalls I've noticed is that sometimes the fruit doesn't ripen fully, and it can also be hard to just get the fruit to fall before it does kind of get desiccated by the cold, because if it stays on the tree too long into the winter, it seems to get pretty gnarly. So it's a little bit delicate balance, but checking out the cultivars that are out there is a great way to start. I mentioned, we've got a nursery around us, Forest Keeling Nursery, that has tons of great varieties, but pretty common to find in East Coast nurseries, lots of different American persimmon varieties. Okay, so I love the American persimmons. Unfortunately, we end up planting a lot more hybrid or Asian persimmons. Now, hybrid persimmons are well suited for our climate. We're in zone 6B, and the hybrid persimmon is a cross between the American persimmon and the Asian persimmon. And the great thing is that they have some of the cold hardiness of the American persimmon, but a lot of the aesthetic traits of the hybrid persimmon. I'm sorry, of the Asian persimmon. Now, the Asian persimmon is a gorgeous tree that if you are in zone 7, 8, or 9, I imagine it is going to be a staple fruit tree of your climate, maybe one of the most commonly planted fruit trees because it is such a beautiful tree, nice glossy leaves. Fruit often hangs on well into the winter. If you get a frost, a lot of times with the Asian persimmon, the leaves will just fall off the tree and you're left with these gorgeous ornaments of Asian persimmons. There's two kinds of Asian persimmons. It's important to know about. Some of them are really hard and astringent, and you have to wait for them to fully ripen inside. And then they're kind of similar to the American persimmons in that they're very gooey and have a super soft texture. There are some other Asian persimmons, which I absolutely adore, that are can be eaten kind of like an Asian pear or an apple. They're crunchy and sweet and absolutely fabulous. So the one that we've had the most success with is Nikita's Gift, and that is a hybrid persimmon, beautiful 12 to 15 feet tall tree. You can see a picture of it here, and we've really had great success with that. We've got less experience with Rosa Yanka, which is another hybrid persimmon, and it's taller, bigger, looks more like an American persimmon, but it does have beautiful leaves. A lot of these, I mentioned that the American persimmon has imparted cold hardiness onto the hybrids, and I believe it's also imparted some of the disease resistance against the black leaf spotting that was mentioned happens with the American persimmon. So the hybrid persimmon is really a big winner for us, but like I said, if you're in zone 7, 8, or 9, I think the straight Asian persimmons, there's a million options there, and they're absolutely fantastic. I so wish that we were a little bit warmer and we could grow those Asian persimmons. I would say I think that's generally about these persimmons here. Let's move on to the pawpaw. Now, the pawpaw, if you're not familiar with, is absolutely all the rage, I feel like, these days, and deservedly so. The pawpaw is the largest fruit tree native to North America. And, if you let that sink in for a second, I'll just say it again, because it is truly remarkable. It's the largest fruit tree native to North America. And how crazy is it that the largest fruit tree growing on our continent natively, is something that the vast majority of Americans or Canadians or wherever you're watching this have never even heard of. And I just find that to be mind-blowing. And I kind of feel like, how crazy is that I didn't know that until I was an adult and got into this. And it turns out that I had woods behind my house, and there was tons of pawpaw trees growing back there, and I had no idea. We'd be out there playing in the woods, and I don't even think I noticed the pawpaws. So, like I said, it is out in the woods, and it is an understory, shade-tolerant crop that produces in the shade, which is pretty remarkable. Now, I will say that it produces way less in the shade, and that's one thing to know. So they can be planted in sun. A lot of times they are going to be much more spread out branching, not going to be very tall in the sun. You know, they can easily be topped at 12 feet and do more side branching with the pawpaws in the sun. If you plant them in the shade, they're going to grow much taller, and they're like you would find in the woods if you haven't seen that. But you know, one of the big issues with pawpaw that we've experienced for when planting for clients is that it's hard to get a big tree. Again, and we have Forest Scaling Nursery here in our area. It is definitely one of those things where we can get a decent sized tree from them, but generally pawpaws are hard to get big trees and they are slow growing. So that's a really important thing that we communicate to clients, is that, you know, a lot of times it takes 3 or 4 years for a fruit tree like an apple or a pear to come into bearing. Some things like pawpaws, we often say, you know, 5-6 years is a good estimate for how long it's going to take for this to come into bearing. So it is slow, but it is a really nice looking tree. You know, you can see the pictures on the left of the page here, and they have a nice form, and that's something to take advantage of. You know, I think they're deserving of planted and exposed areas, and just generally have that Christmas tree shape. They have big, beautiful tropical leaves that look like anything else you can really grow in our climate. So I'm highly into the pawpaws as a landscape tree, as a fruit tree. And if you haven't eaten the fruit, you know, it's just delightful. It's a custard that is very similar to a banana. Only unfortunate thing is it does have a lot of big seeds in there, but scoop out the seeds, eat the flesh. We love to make popsicles from them and freeze them. They don't dehydrate, so don't process them in that way, but they're great in ice cream or other frozen ways. And I can't reiterate this enough. Like the American persimmon, this is not a wild tree anymore, meaning that we have made dozens of great selections of fruit that is early ripening, late ripening, big fleshy fruit, you know, different flavor profiles in different fruits. And, you know, check out there's different pawpaw festivals that are popping up around the country now. It's pretty neat. So I would see if maybe there's a pawpaw festival in your area. At the very least, you know, a lot of times in the eastern United States, these are out in the woods and can be foraged. If you see them up in the tree, you can kind of shake the tree and let them fall. Another thing about falling pawpaws is that you, kind of similar to the persimmon, you kind of want to get them up off the ground, which means they kind of have to fall to the ground, which is a little bit of a bummer. So it's nice to have a lot of mulch around the base of your pawpaw so that when they fall, they kind of fall into a nice cushiony bed. And that's how you know when they're ripe. You don't want to eat a pawpaw that's underripe. It will ripen a little bit on the counter inside, but generally an underripe pawpaw, if you harvest it too early, it will never ripen. And that is truly not something you want to eat. So it'll probably make you sick. So something to think about there with the pawpaws, and we really like to plant them in like groves of 3 or 5. That's how they grow in nature. They kind of sucker and produce whole thickets. A lot of times with the grafted pawpaws, they don't really sucker and have shoots popping up outside the base, but sometimes we've seen that a little bit. And yeah, they're just a pollination thing, you know, is another reason we plant them in groups of 3 or 5, is because they can be finicky pollinators. They're fly pollinated. And so they really benefit from being close to other genetics. So don't plant 3 of the same variety or 5. Make sure you plant 3 different varieties at least and plant them close to each other. And we found that even going around with a paintbrush and hand pollinating is something that can be very effective in increasing fruit set. So that's something to communicate to clients and try it yourself there. All right, so the Jujube. Now this is a very uncommon one that we were very lucky to get turned onto a number of years ago by our friends at Brambleberry Orchard Nursery in Bloomington, Indiana. And they were successfully growing these Jujubes. They're absolutely delicious. They have this beautiful weeping habit. This is a one that currently doesn't really have any pest or disease issues. Kind of tastes like a freeze-dried apple. And we have really enjoyed growing this one. For its ease of growing, for how fast it grows as a fast grower. It's incredibly medicinal. There's tons of literature out there about how medicinal jujubes are. They are dried very easily because of their low water content, and they're commonly found in, Chinese goods stores, Chinatown in New York. Visiting my brother there, and they had, there's dried jujubes everywhere. We have loved getting jujubes from England's Orchard and Nursery, and they've had a great selection, and Cliff England has done a really great job with his collection of jujubes and hybrid persimmons. I should have mentioned that. So if you're looking for interesting hybrid persimmons and just general persimmons for edible landscaping, talk to Cliff England. He also sends scion wood, so because the trees are often kind of small, so you might want to just get your own scion wood and graft them yourself, and to get a nice sized tree. And so, yeah, we've really loved these. I would say that one of the only things I haven't loved is kind of like they have a weeping habit to them, and they can start to weep really low down in their branching. So we love to kind of get these trees staked and get a really nice central trunk going up a good 6 feet tall. And then we'd like to let it start branching at, 5 feet tall-ish. So then those taller branching will kind of weep down, and you can see, I took this picture from the internet here, but that's a great depiction of kind of what these jujube trees kind of generally look like. Okay, so another one from Asia that is what we call like a front yard worthy tree, a tree that is got a nice shape to it, is the che tree. Now, che is a very uncommon fruit tree that there's some good videos on YouTube. Check out the one with Edible Landscaping Nursery did a che video, but these require, you can't be in a cold climate for this. You've got to be in at least zone 6 or 7 because it has a long ripening season. It's actually kind of this big berry that kind of tastes like a watermelon and a raspberry. And it is maybe beside the persimmon, the last of the fruit trees to ripen. It's kind of up there with the jujube and the persimmon. It is kind of a mulberry and fig relative, and it really looks a little bit mulberry-like in the landscape. Tends to abort its fruit early in the year. So early in its life. So years, 3, 4, it's known to abort its fruit. And so that's something to communicate with clients or be aware of. There are a few varieties out there. The most common variety is called like seedless che, and it's from Edible Landscaping. Cliff England also has some different interesting varieties. And so far we haven't really noticed any pests or diseases with this one. So that's another reason why we call it a front yard worthy tree. The Asian persimmon, the che, the jujube, pawpaw, we consider these all front yard worthy because they're all don't really have much in the way of pests and disease, and they work well as edible landscaping plants. This is generally a smaller fruit tree as well, maybe only 12 to 15 feet tall. We love fruit trees that are more manageable in size like that, and makes the fruit way easier to pick. And clients, of course, don't want to be up on ladders too much, and can be very tough to pick small fruit, especially very high up. So the smaller the fruit, kind of the more important it is that it's a smaller tree, because it's a bit precarious picking, way high up small fruits. So one of the other ones that we've had a nice experience with, and speaking of shorter trees, is the pie cherry or the sour cherry. Now the sour cherry, there's a lot of different varieties. We've mostly been planting North Star and Meteor, which are shorter varieties. And these have done really great for us, generally without any sprays or issues, or no pest or disease. The fruits are absolutely stunning. And we found that in a no spray organic environment that, oftentimes we can get beautiful stain-free fruits that, is oftentimes really great to eat just fresh out of hand. So many of the people we talk to, if you say sour cherry, it's oftentimes thought of, oh, well, it's so sour I can't eat it fresh out of hand. Or even pie cherry. Oftentimes I say pie cherry. But I think that's, kind of us just perpetuating problems with our sugar adoration here, and that we can easily eat, these more sour fruits. They're totally palatable in my opinion. Maybe not everybody would love them, but certainly a decent percentage of people I think would totally enjoy these fresh out of hand. You don't need to make pie. So as I said, I think there's little pressure from pest and disease on these. There often are some great small varieties, so that's really nice for picking. They're oftentimes produced in 2 or 3 years. You know, in 3 years, you've oftentimes got a nice looking cherry tree that's producing, which is fantastic. And you know, it also is a very early to produce in a year, which is so nice. A lot of times, pie cherries produce in June, so very early tree fruit. You know, it often follows, you know, strawberries, and then maybe goes with the service berries and June berries, but it's right there after those. There's sour cherries, and there's of course some that are earlier ripening, some that are later ripening. So this is a really nice one that we love to plant. Now, maybe one I love more than any of the others is the mulberry, because mulberry is just so dang easy to grow. You know, if you're not familiar with mulberry, it's kind of known as a weed tree here in our area, but there are so many fantastic varieties. And this is really important to communicate to clients. You know, it's every single one that might be seeding itself around where you live is probably just a random seedling. And the fruit might be amazing, might be terrible. There are improved varieties out there that produce fantastic big fruits, delicious fruits. Some of them are even white fruited, and we have been planting a lot more of the white fruiting mulberries because it's just, they're fantastic in terms of taste and growth, but they also don't really make a mess. You know, that's one of the big issues with mulberries, is that they're very easily seed around. They're spread by birds, and they can kind of germinate anywhere. And they will make a big mess because they poop out all this black fruit, and it can make a mess on the sidewalk and make a mess on the driveway. So the mess is no joke. I wouldn't say that it doesn't. The white mulberries are one way to get around that, or just plant them in a big area where there's, you know, grass all around. If there's grass all around where the tree is, then you don't really have to worry about it. Now, I will say this is one of the bigger trees out there. So this can be a shade tree. You know, mulberries can get 30, 50 feet tall. I've seen some enormous mulberries. Generally, I think it's nice to try to prune them and keep them more, you know, 15, 20 feet tall, but they're going to want to get up there. And one of the ways to deal with that is to shake the branches to get the fruit. Now, like I said, big trees, small fruits, very hard to get the fruit, except with the mulberry. So what you want to do is make sure that you've got your branching that's established on that tree is low down. You want the branching to be happening within 2 to 4 feet, so that you can grab on and shake those branches, and that you can even get some other side branching higher up within your reach. And then if you can't get that, then we will usually get like a picking pole or a rake and grab onto the branches, pull that down, shake the tree, put a tarp underneath the tree, and in instance, you can get this beautiful harvest that's, you know, so fast and easy, and absolutely delicious. Do whatever you want with it, you know, use it the way you would use blackberries or raspberries. A lot of times if you shake the tree, there are some like leaves and different twigs and stuff that get in there, but pick those out for a few minutes, and it's one of the fastest, easiest harvests you can have. It's so abundant and delicious. The chickens will love it. The pigs will love it. You know, feed your little farm animals with it. The birds will often try to beat you to it. We're very lucky in our area where usually I find the mulberry trees are so abundant that the birds only kind of get the ones on the top, and they'll oftentimes leave a lot of the other fruit. So we kind of share it with the birds generally, but I've heard other reports where the birds are very hard to keep off. So that's a thing where you might need to get a kind of a tree net to put over your whole tree to protect the birds from flying in there. And that's one thing to think about. One of the other things I was going to mention is how we process this. Generally, we process this by gathering up all the fruit and blending it all up and freezing it into ice cube trays. You know, we find this is the fastest and easiest way, and then we'll use those ice cubes or I should say mulberry ice cubes in like pancakes. Is kind of my favorite way to do it. So I'll like take a few out, you know, put them in the skillet and melt all the mulberries, and then just put them right over top of pancakes. I'm a lover of a pancake breakfast on Sunday. Another way is to just use them in smoothies. That's another really common way that we use them, is so putting those frozen blocks in smoothies, put them on your pancakes. Maybe I'm sure there's a million other things you can do with them, make jellies and jams and things like that as well. Okay, so Espalier trees. Now, this is kind of getting away from some of the common varieties that we're talking about, but I do want to point it out because I do find that for a lot of context, the Espalier trees are fantastic, so beautiful. There are many great great pear and apple varieties out there. Now, I did mention, pears and apples are subject to more diseases than some other trees, but there are fire blight resistant pears, and you can use European pears, you can use Asian pears. Just make sure they're fire blight resistant, and because that's a big disease that can plague pears. And as you can see in these espalier pictures, they're just absolutely gorgeous. And this is a great way of utilizing a small space, a narrow space, an edge up against a wall, up against a fence. We oftentimes will use this in the tightest of spaces. You can plant an espalier tree like this even where you couldn't plant a shrub, So this is a great option for utilizing it in those tight spaces. And it is really important to note that they require lots of regular pruning. They can be quite vigorous, and that means lots of growth coming off the top. And so check out a book on, or some videos on espalier pruning. Essentially, you just want to make sure you've got some main branches following the trellis that you built. So it's important to have some nice sturdy trellis, especially if you're building this for a client. And we use 4x4 posts and high tension cable wires. We usually use 4 of them. So we'll start at like 2.5 feet up and then go a foot up every there for each tier of the espalier tree. I think generally it's apples and pears that work well for this. So I think figs can also work well if you're in a fig growing climate. If you're in zone 7 or above, this can also work with figs. But generally, I think it's the apples and the pears that this works well with. Okay, so let's move on to shrubs. I talked about mulberries. I absolutely love them. One of the mulberries we love the most is called this Girardi Dwarf Mulberry, and it is another front yard worthy shrub. It's got nice, big, glossy leaves. It's pretty fast growing and absolutely delicious. Now, this one produces copious amounts of blackberries, not white berries. So you do need to be a little bit aware of the birds potentially spreading these around. But we have found this one to be really easy to grow and one of the most delicious berry producers out there. It is more of a small tree even than it is a shrub. Sometimes it is a grafted tree. So a lot of times this is like 8 feet tall and maybe 8 feet wide. So it's kind of a larger shrub. I think it's got more of a bonsai-like shape, and it seems like it could be pretty easily pruned to keep more of a small specimen tree. So this, I think, would be a nice one to kind of isolate on its own and give it some praiseworthy locations where you can kind of see the 3-dimensionality of it and the nice shape of it. Maybe our most commonly planted fruit tree is the serviceberry. So sometimes it goes by serviceberry, juneberry, shadbush, shadblow, all different kinds of names around the world. It's a Amelanchier, and they're native to the northern United States and Canada, as well as, there's native ones in northern United States and Canada that are Canadensis alnifolia, and those are much more bush-like. Those are like 4 to 6 feet tall and are much more like a blueberry alternative. We plant a number of them called Regent, and the Regent serviceberry is like a more commonly available bush serviceberry. There's even some landscaping companies or landscape supply wholesalers that will have really nice Regents that you can get mail ordered. However, a lot of times those in our warmer zone 6 will lose their leaves late in the year. They kind of will, defoliate a little bit, and it's kind of a bummer when they lose their leaves like that. But they can often have beautiful copious amounts of delicious berries right around June 1st in our area. And so those are some of the small ones. We oftentimes, like I said, we promote them as an alternative to blueberries. With blueberries, we try to avoid them because they have the acid loving soil requirements, and that's just kind of one step that we found to be a little bit frustrating as an edible landscaping company, and feels like we've missed the mark on that before, and clients are not super excited about that. So it's one of those things that needs to be dialed in on each different site, and is a little bit more work than I think is worth it for us, because we have these other great alternatives that we can plant beside blueberries. That doesn't mean we don't ever plant blueberries. Sometimes if a client is really excited about it, we'll definitely make the effort to try, but we often kind of give the caveat that sometimes blueberries are finicky and we don't find them to be super fruitful. So that's the shrubs. The other serviceberry is what you see pictured on the left. Now this is what the kind that we are planting all over, and this is maybe our most common, as I said, because it's a native fruit tree. It often doesn't have any pest or disease issues. It is just such a beautiful fall color and produces tons of berries. Oftentimes they can get a little bit tall, so it's nice to, you know, have a ladder or, you know, drive up with a truck or something like that. But generally you can bend the branches down and pick the vast majority of the fruits. You can see how beautiful the fruits are. You know, they're great for eating fresh out of hand. This is not one that needs to be processed. It does have a small edible seed inside, but we find that seed to be pretty insignificant and even flavorful. So this is one that would love to see planted, you know, all over town. It's already planted, you know, in the most interesting of places like church parking lots, and I've seen it in a Costco parking lot. So it is already has awareness around, you know, being a landscape plant. People don't even realize it's a delicious fruit producing plant. And the reason that sometimes it even gets planted in parking lots and along streets is because the birds will clean the fruit up if you don't get it. So a lot of times there's this kind of a critical window where the fruit starts to ripen. And it's almost a little bit where you can see in this picture where like a lot of the fruits are pinkish and some of them are starting to turn purple. This is generally when you have to go harvest all the fruit, even though it means some of the fruit is going to be a little bit underripe. It's still delicious, still totally edible. Highly encourage you to eat it. The big reason to do that is because if you kind of wait till they're all ripe, birds might just pick them off, and they can make quick work of a tree. So in just an instant, you might see all the birds swoop in, and an hour later, all the fruits are gone. That is a harsh reality. But generally, if you're on it with the June berries early in the summer, early in their harvest window, then you'll be just fine and able to get a fantastic harvest. All right, so maybe the easiest to grow of all the fruiting plants, the elderberry. This one up there with the mulberry. You know, the elderberry is a beautiful native shrub. It is kind of a suckering, wild-looking, very adaptable plant, and it grows really fast. An elderberry can grow like 6 to 8 feet in 1 year. You know, so we often will cut them back down to the ground, and it'll grow way tall and create a hedge in just 1 year. And then when you cut it down to the ground, you can use all of those branches as propagation material. They're very easy to root. You know, a lot of times here in our climate, we'll take cuttings in late February, March, early March, and all those cuttings can kind of just be stuck in the ground and they'll root, which is incredible. Or you can take those cuttings, give them away to friends. Really, this is our go-to screening shrub when we need to create a fast, beautiful screen. You can see in the picture on the left, absolutely incredibly beautiful flowers, tons of great improved varieties out there. A lot of them are right here from my home state of Missouri. University of Missouri Center for Agroforestry is been doing breeding work, and these are more of a medicine crop, so that's a really important thing to know. This is not a food crop. So once you harvest the elderberries, they are to be processed into medicine, and you can do different things with them. But they really hit that multi-purpose shrub category. You know, they're just so adaptable. The one thing to keep an eye out for if you're planting these is that they can spread a little bit. You know, they will root sucker. So if you plant one, you know, you might see some sprouts popping up a few feet away, and that is, you know, those can just be mowed off, or you can let that whole thicket form. You know, so it kind of just depends on the management that you're going for, but it is very much, it will create like a dense thicket if you let it, and they'll get 12 feet tall probably if you don't prune them each year. And they're quite beautiful. I love them as a back of the landscape design feature. And you know, there's a lot of potential with the elderberry, especially commercially. You know, we're seeing opportunities to get into elderberry production with the juice. I'm sure many of you are familiar with, wintertime immune support from the elderberry. And another thing I'll point out that I'm seeing here is that it is part sun adapted. So don't plant this in the full shade, but if you get a handful of hours, maybe 4 hours of sun in a spot, these are often in forest edges, like so many of the fruiting plants. And so I would encourage you to plant these in areas maybe don't get so much sun, and you'll probably still be successful, which is great. Now, Aronia is maybe the opposite fruiting shrub of elderberry in the sense that it is a very tidy, nice looking plant. It is super landscape ready. There is very little pest and disease pressure. I found that in some locations, like the birds will just leave them forever and they never really pick them off. And in some cases, the birds will kind of go after them a little bit. But regardless, they have the highest antioxidant fruit that we can possibly eat. They're packed full of nutrients. They're very easy to grow, beautiful fall color. And this one is ready to be on the main stage. There's even some new, very low growing varieties coming out that are kind of ground covery. So I'm excited to try those out and utilize them more as a ground cover there. The Aronias can get like 4 to 7 feet tall. So that's something to keep an eye out. Generally, I've found them to be more in the 5-foot range. And just a really nice front yard worthy landscape plant. The really only downside thing is that they're not very good for eating out of hand. They're tough. They're much more better to process, freeze them. If you're somebody who sweetens pies and things like that, that they would go well into a pie. We put them in smoothies more than anything to just mix them with other flavors because the flavor is a little bit chalky, not ideal. And but if you have a client who's like really into health and wellness, or they just are wanting to think about medicine crops or medicinal crops in the landscape, elderberry and Aronia are great medicine type crops. So they have that dual purpose as well. Okay, so this is one of the most unique plants that we plant and is often really exciting for clients. This is the Trifoliate hardy orange, and this is the flying dragon. So flying dragon trifoliate is it is a shrub that's maybe 6 to 8 feet in height and width, and it is a true like orange type plant. It's just absolutely gorgeous, thorny as can be, super contorted, makes these racquetball size oranges that are very sour and very seedy. They're kind of like a lime or a lemon substitute. There's not a lot of good flesh in there, so they really lend themselves to juicing and to kind of like squeeze all the juice out and use it as you would lemon juice or lime juice. But boy, these are really beautiful. They're great to use as like specimen plantings. We try to like isolate them alone and don't plant anything more than 6 inches tall around the base. They really lend themselves well to just being featured without other plants and flowers growing right around them. And they are hardy to zone 6. They can handle up to -10 degrees. So it's one of the things I really love about these is just how hardy they are, how beautiful they are, no pest or disease issues, really an incredible conversation piece. We love trying to plant these in our restaurant foodscapes because it's such an interesting one that I think restaurants are well adapted to have as a conversation piece to utilize in their dishes. And this one can be a bit slow growing as well, so that's something to keep in mind. It's not an immediate result here, and they do take, we found many, they can take several years to fruit, and a good 4 to 5 years to be able to fruit. So Trifoliate hardy orange, this one is just such a huge winner and such a fascinating one in the edible landscape. So highly encourage folks to experiment with this one. So one that we have less experience with is the beach plum. Now the beach plum is a native shrub plum native to the East Coast. And there's very few nurseries that carry them. And the ones that do carry them, they're often very small. We've been experimenting with a bunch that we got from Oikos Nursery, which is recently just closed. They had a handful of their own improved varieties, but in general, this is like a plum that doesn't have much in the way of pest and disease issues in our experience. Got 2 of them in my yard, and we're just kind of getting into planting more of them. We don't have a good supply for them. So this is one to just keep in mind, but boy, do they have beautiful spring flowers, just absolutely gorgeous, kind of like a cherry. Would have just a huge profusion of white flowers. And this is an interesting one if you're into breeding. You know, there's tons of improvement that I think can be made. There's different yellow fruited varieties out there, and this is kind of a new one that hopefully we'll see will hit more of the stage, main stage in the next, you know, in our lifetime here. A lot of times they're, you know, I think 4 to 6 feet tall, and not, you know, one of the things I like about them is how they produce like a small fruit late in the season. I think they generally are like in the August window, so way after the traditional plums are eaten. August is a, you know, maybe different in different parts of the country when they produce, but that's kind of when they come on for us. And that's oftentimes like a time of year where there's not a ton of fruit actually. Can be really challenging to, you know, we get the summer fruits in July, in June, July, and then a lot of times we have this dip before the fall fruits come in. So this is an interesting one to experiment with, and to try to kind of fill that fruit window as well. Now, another native fruiting plant that we like is the rivies odoratum, or the clove currant. Now, this is a native currant, produces really interesting, delicious blackberries. Another shrub that's kind of like 4 to 6 feet tall. It is a, it's known as the clove currant because it produces a profusion of yellow flowers in the spring that kind of smell clove-like. And this one, we have noticed that even sometimes they lose their leaves in the fall, which is kind of a bummer. Sometimes they don't, and when they don't lose their leaves, they have a really nice red fall color to them. Haven't totally figured out what contributes to them losing their leaves or not, but one cool thing about them is that they do have a shade tolerance. You know, they can handle part shade. So not a ton of fruits would be recommended for partial shade, but the clove currant is one of them. So that's one to check out. And another one that I absolutely adore is the fig. Now, for those of you who are zone 7 or above, you know, figs, I mentioned like with the persimmon, Asian persimmon, boy, these are a edible landscape winner. Huge, I mean, beautiful, so easy to grow. They often in warmer climates will produce like 2 different crops, a summer crop and a fall crop. And the new growth is where they produce a fall crop. The old growth is where they produce the summer crop. And they just have big, beautiful tropical leaves, and they can often just get, you know, you'll have to look up depending on what climate you're in. If you're in zone probably 8 or above, you can probably get these to be really huge, you know, 12, 15 feet span and height. So that's something to be aware of. In our climate, we grow them much more as like 6 to 8 foot multi-stem shrubs, and we oftentimes will plant them in protected microclimates, you know, south-facing walls. South-facing against a house is really great, brick wall. And then we bend all the branches down. We've got some YouTube videos on this if you want to check out Custom Foodscaping fig videos. We bend all the branches down and then build kind of like a moat, a whole enclosure of straw bales, and we put it around it. And then, you know, the more of the branches that you can bend to the ground and, you know, keep protected over the winter, the next spring they kind of spring back up, and you can get a really nice fall crop. So this is one that, you know, we absolutely adore. It's so fast growing as well. Like when you, in a single year, can easily grow 6 feet. So usually by midsummer, you know, if you've uncovered your protection, you've got a nice looking plant that's at least 4 feet tall, if not bigger, by midsummer. And then by the fall, a lot of times 6 to 8 feet, like I mentioned, if not, you know, maybe even up to 10 feet. But like I said, you know, this is really one that requires in our climate a microclimate. So make sure that you plant it in a hot spot, you know, by some big rocks, but up against a house. If you're in a warmer climate, you know, don't worry about that. So another one, we have planted a lot of our bush cherries. Now we were planting tons of Nanking cherries, which is really fast growing. You can see a picture here, beautiful white flowers, huge loads of fruit. The fruits are pretty tart, and they're more for snacking on, and just they're not, you know, super fleshy, not great for processing tons of amounts, although I'm sure you could. these are really fast growing, you know, they can get 8 feet tall. And we have noticed that a lot of times the Nanking cherries are starting to die early in their life, and we don't really know why, but kind of after several years, they might start to conk out and they just kind of go brown, lose their leaves. Um, there are others that are not doing like that, like Carmine Jewel is another one that is way less available in general, but we've been planting those. And so Carmine Jewel is a really small, it's like a pie cherry, but bigger than a Nanking cherry and easier, probably, you know, easier to grow in the sense that it doesn't really have that issue that the Nanking cherries do. One of the other things that we found is some places are offering Carmine Jewel as a grafted tree. So it has a nice form, you know, and it's dwarfing, super dwarfing. So oftentimes if you see Carmine Jewel grafted, then it will be a like a nice little specimen tree that can be pruned into a really great shape. There are some other, especially if you're in a northern climate, there's a lot of other bush cherry varieties like Joel and Jan and Jill and all these other ones that have been put out, I think, by the University of Saskatchewan. But check out different bush cherries, and because there's a whole bunch of different good ones out there, and a lot of them don't really have any pest or disease issue and lend themselves really well to edible landscaping. Okay, so gumi is one of those really interesting ones. The gumi is maybe the, you know, the fastest growing of the shrubs I've ever planted. You know, this thing gets up and going, and in 2 years you've got a really nice shrub. Produces huge amounts of really tart berries. I find the tartness to be delicious. You know, I really enjoy them. They are not for everybody. You know, they're not a super sweet, easy to eat fruit. They have an edible seed inside, and they kind of even have like a little bit of a weeping habit to them, and they've got really nice glossy leaves, totally front yard worthy, nice looking shrub. They can get rather tall, you know, they can get 8 feet tall, but you know, I think it'd be easy to manage them at 6 feet or so. They also will fruit in some shade, which I love, and they're not really bothered by much pest or disease issues at all. You know, I've never, in my 10 years growing the gummies, I've never really seen pest or disease issues on them. Sometimes the birds will eventually clean them up, it seems. So that's one thing to keep in mind. And there are several different varieties of gumi out there, and you do want to have 2 different varieties for cross-pollination there. So we did get excited that there's a new variety called Tillamook that One Green World came out with, and that produces much bigger berries, and we've been really excited about those bigger berries. And so definitely love gumi as another like hedge plant. You know, kind of looks a little bit wild, kind of like the elderberry I mentioned, you know, but it's not quite as wild. But it's just it's a nice looking shrub, fast growing, great hedge plant, and just a nice, like, you know, homestead crop. If somebody's more into alternative, easy to grow, just want to be successful, don't mind tart fruits, this is a really great one for that. Okay, so hardy kiwi brings us into the vines. Now, hardy kiwi is a really beautiful plant. Oftentimes, these are, you know, beautiful, shiny, glossy leaves that don't have pest or disease issues. Now, the hardy kiwi there's several different species, and some of them are more vigorous than others. The Actinidia arguta is the more common one with lots of varieties, and that one requires male and female. And these are vigorous growers that can grow on a whole barn, like you can see here. You know, they can become huge vines, and you really, very important, you need a huge structure to support your hardy kiwis. Don't grow these on a little tiny garden trellis or arbor. They need a structure. So they take several years to fruit as well, so that you really need to let them develop and grow over a whole structure before they're going to fruit for you. There is also Actinidia colomicta. Now, colomicta has much fewer varieties, but they do have like this variety that has pink in the leaves on the male. And so check out the colomicta kiwis. and get that male variety that's got the beautiful pink leaves, because that one is really interesting and adds a whole new flavor into the edible landscape dimension with that color. And that one is less vigorous than the Arguta. That one, I remember in the Lee Reich tour that I did at his property, he was recommending the Colomicta kiwis. And then finally, there's another one. There's I think one kind of like general self-fertile kiwi. I forget what species that is. I think it's Issai, like Issai. And it is a self-fertile kiwi that is kind of what we're moving towards planting more of, because you only need one of them. And so that one might be the winner for edible landscaping, or if you have more farm space or just bigger trellises in general, you know, plant the two where you need the male and the female. But these are, you know, if you haven't had hardy kiwis, they're absolutely delicious. They taste like just little kiwis that are kind of like grapes, and they are fall producing. And so they're a great grape alternative because they are generally have much nicer looking foliage than the grapes. Speaking of grapes, you know, I do love grapes, and of course they're going to be much more easily accepted by the masses because everybody's had delicious grapes. Now, the big problem is that so many grapes are not from this country, and they are susceptible to disease. And so, unfortunately, a lot of the main common varieties that we get at the grocery store are very diseased, but there are quite a lot of lesser known grape varieties that actually do really well. And one of my fruit growing mentors, a guy named Guy Ames, he has an orchard and nursery. If you check out Guy Ames Orchard and Nursery, he's in Fayetteville, Arkansas, and I highly recommend checking out his website, because he's been spending decades on growing organic fruit and figuring out which varieties really do well for with minimal, you know, pest and disease pressure. So he's done these trials with all different kinds of varieties, and check out those grape varieties that he lists. You know, we've had success with certain varieties, Edelweiss and Ben-Hur and some other different varieties that are actually native grapes. You know, there's a huge resurgence hopefully happening of native grape wine production. And, you know, there are many different species of native grapes to North America that we don't have a lot of awareness of. And a lot of times, many of these are great, really sweet. You know, the Concord grape is one of them that you may be familiar with. And so the grapes, I would say, you know, definitely don't shy away from planting them, but make sure that you get those good disease-resistant varieties that don't have the fungal diseases. And then what I don't have on here is muscadine grapes. Now, muscadine grapes are a different kind of grape that are absolutely grade A, edible landscape, all-star, beautiful shiny leaves. They look nothing like the other kinds of grapevines that we're used to. And they produce big, beautiful fruit and are absolutely gorgeous. However, they're not super hardy. So if you're in zone 7 or above, highly recommend, I think it's probably, you know, a edible landscape all-star, the muscadine grape. But if you are in zone 6, like I am, it's like marginally hardy, and we're trialing it more and more. And then if you are zone 5 or above, or below, I should say, probably not one that you want to grow. It's probably not hardy enough. Now, I can't say enough about strawberries. You know, every client that we have, if we would love to find a strawberry patch. You know, oftentimes the easiest to grow fruits are the berries. You know, the places that we always start in our biggest demographic are, you know, parents in their 30s and 40s with young kids. Getting berry patches established is our favorite. You know, blackberries, raspberries, strawberries. Now, strawberries are a perennial ground cover. They spread. It's nice to get them in a whole patch area. They don't mix super well with other plantings. So they're a nice one to kind of give a whole ground cover planting to. And you can plant them around a tree. You can plant them as a ground cover around like shrubs, or even plant them as a ground cover around blackberries and raspberries, and just kind of let them do their understory thing. We have there's so many different varieties out there. So if you're going to plant a big patch, make sure you get different varieties that ripen at different times. And you know, we have had some issues with critters and getting to the strawberries, so we've used insect netting on top of them. Now note, that's not bird netting. Insect netting we've had really good success with in covering up the strawberries once they set fruit. And we also love alpine strawberries. Now alpine strawberries are this most delectable kind of custardy, beautiful fruits that are much smaller than the traditional strawberries we're used to, but they don't spread. They stay put, and it's for that reason that we often use them as borders and edges. They're a nice, tidy, like 1 square foot plant, and they, only thing we notice with them is they're kind of sometimes die out, you know, after a few years. They're not super hardy, long-lived perennials like the traditional strawberries are. So kind of marginally push them. I think the right client, you know, make sure that they know sometimes these are not always long-lived. You know, they might only get 2 great years of harvest. And we've also been experimenting with some of these like low-growing bushel and berry brambles. Marginal success here. These are ones that are kind of marketed as being lower-growing blackberries and raspberries. We've had more success with the raspberry, but still haven't found it to be very high-yielding. So unfortunately, these haven't been big winners for us. You know, mixing in amongst with all of the perennial trees and shrubs that we talked about, I can't say enough about just herbs. You know, herbs are generally the way that we can create all different colors and textures and heights, and it's just, herbs are limitless with their possibilities. And so that's kind of what we will utilize as plantings around our fruit trees and shrubs. Now, it's important to keep in mind that you're getting colorful as much as possible. So we love to use purple plants like, you know, purple shiso or purple basil as annuals to fill in and create different color. Or even this like golden color is so beautiful, and you can find some varieties like this. This is like golden jubilee anise hyssop, which is a beautiful anise hyssop. It can be used in tea and creates a whole different color differential. We love to find spots for mint. So mint is a spreading ground cover that's maybe my favorite of all the herbs. It's so easy to use in drinks and tea. We like to plant mint in like already siphoned off areas where there's a lot of concrete on either end, and you can see in the bottom left-hand picture there's like a driveway with a little grassy strip. That's a great mint candidate. Or kind of on the sides of houses where there's patios, and you know, between the patio and the house, a lot of times you can kind of let a mint patch run wild and do its thing, and then you don't have to worry about spreading into other places where you don't want your mint. Because if you haven't grown mint, it will go ahead and spread and, you know, go anywhere it is allowed to go. So make sure you keep it in kind of its own little area. And if you don't do that, you can put it in a pot. But generally, I love to have lots of mint. It's an incredible bee attractor. I mean, the bees go absolutely bonkers on the mint flowers, and there's endless uses of the actual mint plant. A few of the creeping plants we've liked, you know, we've used a lot of creeping thyme, and that's a fantastic super low growing ground cover. Roman chamomile is another perennial ground cover we've loved. The chamomile is not as great as the annual chamomile, and it does get, it's a beautiful ground cover when it's not flowering, but when it's flowering, it's kind of like at least a foot tall. So it's not super ground covery when it's flowering for a few months of the summer, but in the spring and in the winter, it's got gorgeous, just apple scented. I love the foliage is so pretty and fluffy, and it smells incredible, and it makes beautiful, of course, you know, little daisy-like flowers with the chamomile. So even if you don't use them medicinally or in tea, you can utilize the chamomile flowers, you know, just for their beauty. All right, so some of the low growers that we love, a lot of these are shade plantings. So a lot of times we've got plantings in the shade where we want to grow food, you know, and so these are some of our favorites. If you're not familiar, hostas are a big winner. We have access to so many different varieties. We really like the lime green chartreuse hostas, the ones that are really big leafed, because they make big shoots. So when the shoots come up in the spring, like you can see in the picture, we cut those and use it as asparagus. Solomon seal on the right is the same thing. It's another shoot vegetable. It's a beautiful shade garden native plant, and the shoots come up in the spring, and you can use it just as you would asparagus. Sweet Sicily is a black licorice flavored plant. You can see on the bottom left, it's produces a really delicious seed pod that's kind of like a little candy treat, and the leaves are also edible. So we love using that one. Fuki is another really beautiful one that has a very tropical looking large leaf to it, and it's a spreader. So be very careful about the Fuki. It needs to be in a place where it can't get too out of control, but would recommend that, the Fuki is a beautiful texture, and you can utilize the stalks. They're edible as well, kind of like a rhubarb stalk a little bit. Some of my favorites that are just so adaptable, chives and garlic chives. If you're like me, you're using onions and garlic in so many dishes, and you can almost always substitute chives and garlic chives for those, and those are beautiful, super easy to grow, hardy perennial herbs that can be put in anywhere. Garlic chives will spread by seed, so it's really important to make sure you deadhead those flowers after they're spent before they spread their seed. Daylilies, all parts of them are edible, and they're so adaptable. We like to use those in really tough places, hillsides, rain garden edges, tight little spaces where you don't want anything to get too tall or crazy. They do spread. They've got edible spring shoots, edible flowers, edible buds, edible roots. So many parts of the daylily are traditionally used edibly. And violets. Violets are a very often overlooked perennial vegetable. And here, they grow wild everywhere, but people don't see them for their food benefit. They have delicious edible leaves. They're most delicious in the spring and when they're young. And the flowers are edible. They're so beautiful. You can use the flowers to dye water, and they make a beautiful pink water. And generally, you can even cut these leaves and cook them really any time of year. They are a great ground cover and a great, just super low plant if you need something that doesn't get more than 6 inches tall. I think violets are a huge winner and very little used in the intentional plantings. Now, if you've got tight spaces, some of the plants we love, we've got the maypop or the passion fruit. In our climate, we've got the Passiflora incarnata, which is our native passion fruit, and it makes the most beautiful flowers. The leaves are edible as well, and the tips of the leaves are really tender and delicious. They do need something to climb, but they are an herbaceous vine, meaning they die back to the ground each year. So they don't need a huge hardy kiwi-like trellis. They can grow much more on like a 6 foot tall by 4 foot trellis, probably be a minimum, but you can do them on a rather minimal trellis. And the thing to know about the maypops are that they spread excessively, and they will, if you plant them in the ground, they're going to spread all over the place. So you want to plant them in a tight, confined space where they can't come up other places. You don't want them spreading around the yard. So be very careful about those. Bamboo, the same thing. It's another spreader. And so you want to plant it in a tight, confined space. I think pretty much almost all the shoots of different bamboo varieties are edible. So bamboo is another multi-use, beautiful plant that can be used as a screen, can be used as a building material, and the spring shoots are edible. I already mentioned the mints. I think they're a fantastic ground cover as well for those tight, confined spaces. Now, a few things I want to talk about in terms of saving them for the backyard. Now, currants, gooseberries, raspberries, blackberries, apples, peaches, things like that. We love planting these. These are, it's really important to look for the most disease-resistant varieties. Now, currants and gooseberries, not really a big deal. A lot of those are fairly easy to grow. They just kind of don't look good. A lot of times the leaves get, foliar damage, especially late summer, fall. They don't look too good, but the fruits are absolutely beautiful. So highly encourage planting gooseberries and currants, red currants, black currants. All of the currants are fantastic. They do have a little bit of an acquired taste, more tart. Blackberries and raspberries, I say plant them everywhere. Plant them in every single backyard. Pretty much all the varieties are easy to grow, and they just need a good sturdy trellis. That's the main thing with the blackberries and the raspberries. Make sure you give them a big, nice, sturdy trellis. Love to plant them along edges of properties in front of fruit tree plantings, you know, because they're much shorter than the fruit trees. They only get 6-7 feet tall. And then, you know, other things to keep in the backyard are just some of the more common fruit trees, apples and pears. Make sure you get those disease-resistant apples and pears. Look for disease-resistant peaches and as well. We've found plums to be pretty challenging. Don't often recommend those, but we're experimenting more with the plums. So just look for the disease resistance on those. You know, I don't have amazing things to say about variety selection there, but except disease resistance is so important when it comes to the avoiding some of the really pervasive diseases, especially that are common in the eastern part of the United States. So with that said, that's really it. You know, that is those are the plants that make this possible for us. And you know, so hope that you enjoyed this presentation. If you have any follow-up questions about this, you'll be able to ask those questions in the platform, or you can email me at matt@customfoodscaping.com. Go to Custom Foodscaping, write in on our website if you have a specific question about anything. And thanks so much for making it to the end here. Hope you all enjoy the rest of these presentations.